not only was he as a businessman, and there's an awful lot of businessmen who manage to spend a lot of time in a place without absorbing anything. Rick is just the opposite. Ricardo.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? Thank you very much. Thank you, John. And thank you for inviting me tonight. Wan Shang Hao. That means good evening, everybody. And tonight we'll talk about the Great Decisions program about China. Has anybody read the article? There was a piece that came out about China. Did anybody read it? Okay, well, okay, I'm going to give you the summary of the article tonight. And how many of you been to China? Quite a few. Okay, I should tell you, my wife Joan is here, the lady wearing the mask, because everybody in China wears masks all the time, long before COVID. And she's here to make sure that I'm honest and don't exaggerate anything. Okay. So the Great Decisions book is kind of interesting. I was sort of startled when I first read the book because it talks about a new Cold War with China, and it talks about containment. Those are the two themes in the book. And then they build the article around that. And, I really hadn't thought about it quite the way it was presented in the book in the context that we're entering a new Cold War. I read that a couple of months ago, and a lot of things have changed, and it sure looks like we're in a new Cold War, doesn't it? Most of us lived through the Cold War. So it also talks about spheres of influence. This is an interesting concept used in foreign policies. Again, I really hadn't thought about the conflict or the competition between China and the United States quite in this way, but it really is a good analogy. And where the Monroe Doctrine was the United States, an example that we had of our spheres of influence that we asserted long ago. The President Monroe asserted that the Caribbean was America's sphere of influence and all the European powers should stay out. That same concept is being tested now in the Far East. The second analogy in the book, in the article, was that we're entering a new Cold War between the United States and China. And so let's explore these ideas, and you can decide for yourselves as we go through this presentation this evening. When we talk about spheres of influence, one of the things they did not have in the book is this map. They had the example of the Monroe Doctrine, but I don't know if you realize that the European and Asian powers carved up China between 1842 all the way really till 1942, when the Japanese occupied Shanghai. That's when the final European powers were expelled from China. So it was the Opium Wars in 1842. The spheres of influence were do we have a pointer here or not? No pointer. Okay, sorry. So during the Opium Wars, the spheres, China ceded Hong Kong and eventually the first 5 treaty ports. Eventually, there was a second Opium War in the 1860s, more treaty ports, and eventually we got to these areas that are controlled by different countries. And you can see the green is the British sphere of influence, where they basically control the trading rights along the Yangtze River. Changjiang is the Chinese word for Yangtze River, and Tibet. The Russians were in the north. Eventually, and then by the 1930s, the Japanese had forced the Russians out, and they replaced them. And then the French were in the south. The Germans had colonies in a place called Qingdao. Anybody hear of Qingdao beer? That's where how we got that. So China was carved up like a melon. And this little picture on the right is a picture I took in the Shanghai Museum. This is a cartoon showing the European and Japanese powers carving up China into various economic zones. And they had extraterritorial rights, so they had their own laws in those territories. Chinese law was not enforced. Sale of opium was legal. And the Chinese greatly resent this. They call this the century of humiliation. And this is still referred to even recently in some of Xi Jinping's speeches. And they teach this in the schools. As I said, this cartoon is actually from an exhibit in the Shanghai Museum that I took in, I think, 2017 when I went back to visit some friends. So they deeply resent this century of humiliation. This drives a lot of what they're doing today. Or they use this to rev up their population against the foreign influences. They want to to correct the wrongs of the past. This lasted until 1949, when the Civil War was, the communists prevailed in the Civil War, and the nationalists were expelled from China. And so I can do it right here. Okay. So by 1949, the communists expelled the nationalists fled to Taiwan. And by 1950, the communists consolidated power all over China. And we entered a new phase where China basically went into an isolated period of time where they were trying to consolidate their power in the mainland. But there's the Civil War left one uncompleted task, and that was a reunification with Taiwan, which still haunts us to this day. In 1949, October 1st, 1949, Mao Zedong stood up in Tiananmen Square, and he proclaimed that the Chinese people have stood up. That's what those characters mean. That the Chinese people, the first three, I can read the first three, Zhongguo Ren, that means Chinese people, the first three characters, have stood up. And you'll hear that phrase in a second, in a couple more slides. To this day, October 1st, we know it because it was a national holiday in China, much like our 4th of July. We would get the week off from work on the week of that holiday. Now, as Mao looked out into the world, in his sphere of influence that they defined as the first island chain in the South China Sea. The trouble is, this is where Taiwan is, and this is where we assert that this is international waters, essentially under our influence. So this became the potential point of conflict between the spheres of influence that the Chinese claimed and the spheres of influence that we claim. So this is where the potential conflict exists. The trouble is the Chinese had no way of enforcing their territorial claims in 1949. It was a very poor country, militarily weakened, and they really had no way of enforcing their claims. And Taiwan just lingered there, protected by the United States. So in doing the book, this idea that we're entering a new Cold War, there are three big differences between the analogy used in the article of the Cold War that we all grew up with, and the Cold War that's potentially we're entering today. And the first is that we would never had a trade interdependence with Russia, with the Soviet Union, that we have with China. We have a huge trade interdependence. We're China's biggest customer. Are they going to blow up their biggest customer? And they're our biggest supplier. We found out during the pandemic, we really are dependent on Chinese goods and services. The second potential difference is nuclear proliferation. It was a bipolar world during the Cold War that we grew up in. And today there's nuclear proliferation. There are many actors that have nuclear weapons. And this changes the nuclear dynamics, unfortunately. I would argue it's probably a more dangerous world today than it was back then. The third big difference is our two countries have a climate interdependence. China's the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. We're right behind them. We're trying to work with China and the rest of the world to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. So those are the three differences between the Cold War of the past and the Cold War today. There's a lot of incentive for us to work with the Chinese. The book goes on to talk about military expenditures, and it makes the case that the Chinese, if you look at the bottom graph, this chart is right out of the book. The Chinese are spending a lot of money on investing in military equipment. They certainly have been a very rapid increase in their investment. But if you look at the numbers closely, this is about 240 billion, and ours is about 760 billion. So they're spending about 1/3 of what we're spending on military investment. On the other hand, we have what I like to call as our whole empire to protect, whether it's in Russia and Ukraine, or in the Middle East, or in the Far East. So we are the policemen of the world, and not just of the Far East. If you look at this a different way, this is expenditures by the United States and its allies compared to China. This dark blue is the United States. This is Australia and Japan, and then this is NATO, and this is comparing this to China's spending and to Russia's spending. So as a percent of world spending, we're almost 60% of the spending, and China and Russia are less than 20%. This is, I think, from 2018. this particular chart. So it's a scary world, but we are certainly spending a lot of money on military and spending even more every year. When you look at nuclear forces, the Russians and the United States have substantially more nuclear capabilities, and the Chinese have hardly any. They're all the way down here. But that is changing. The Chinese are investing a lot of money in the modernizing and building a new nuclear force, and they expect to have 1,500 nuclear warheads by 2035. So this is going to be a major, they will be equivalent to the United States. And the reason they're doing this is so that we can't threaten them. We can say now, if you invade Taiwan, we might, or at least in the past, we have nuclear supremacy over you. Well, that won't be the case in the future. They will be able to annihilate us as much as we can annihilate them, which is going to force us maybe to talk with each other. But it's not going to be us telling them what to do anymore. At least that's their objective. So let's go back a little bit. I first went to China in 95, and I would live there from 2005 to 2015. And I've always been interested in China all my life. So a lot has changed in our lifetime in China and in China's relationship with the United States and the world. And how do we get here? Let's think about that. It kind of started, we all remember maybe this photo. This is Zhou Enlai on the left and Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon got invited to Beijing for dinner. It was put together by Henry Kissinger. And I'm asked the question several times, why the different colored chopsticks? The red chopsticks are used for serving. That's a very polite dinner. So that Zhou Enlai is serving shrimp, it looks like. He's picking shrimp up from the Lazy Susan and putting it down on Nixon's plate. And then the white chopsticks are to eat off your own plate. Now, if you live in China, there's only one set of chopsticks and everybody digs in and shares the germs. So I see a few of you smiling. You've seen that. Anyway, this trip was put together by Kissinger. And who would ever think that we would see this picture, those of us around in 1972, of Nixon shaking hands with Mao Zedong, with Chairman Mao. So much has changed in the world at that time and changed since then. Nixon was the famous anti-communist politician that ran on that campaign in the McCarthy years. And things changed. Why did they change? Well, the Chinese have been having conflicts with the Russians on their northern border over control. Actually, they almost went to war over control of a couple islands in the middle of a river in the late 1960s. And people were talking about a nuclear war between China and Russia. And this was people in the United States were in disbelief. We always saw them as one empire. They were united. And in fact, took us a while to realize that China and Russia were not aligned. In fact, they're having a lot of tensions. The factory I worked with in central China, in Henan province, used to be in Manchuria. And the Chinese moved all their factories away from the border, and all the people that operated those factories, they moved them to central China to put them out of range of Russian bombers. They were that concerned about war. At the same time, we had a problem in Vietnam. We were trying to extricate ourselves from Vietnam, and we wanted the Chinese help in getting us out of Vietnam. And we wanted to use the Chinese to offset what the Russians were doing in the world. So it was a very clever diplomatic move by Henry Kissinger. And this resulted in the famous 1972 trip to China, which really upended the whole world of world diplomacy and the world balance of power. But this dinner that Nixon had was not for free. 3 communiques are still officially part of the United States-China relationship. And the first was at this dinner, the 1972 Shanghai Communique, which still governs a lot of our relations with China, at least officially. The second one was a 1979 communique put together by the Carter administration. And the third one was a 1982 communique by the Reagan administration. So the 3 different communiques, and let's go through them really quickly, because I think it's important to understand them. The first one is the Shanghai Communique of 1972, which Nixon and Kissinger put together. There's Kissinger, Zhou Enlai. John, I didn't see you in this picture, I'm sorry. So, okay, just teasing. So the China's position in this communique was that what we hear now is a one China policy. China's viewpoint is Taiwan is a China's internal affair. We signed this agreement, okay? And that no other country has the right to interfere. We signed this. This is what the cost of Nixon's dinner. But the U.S. Put in there what John has taught me is constructive ambiguity. Is that what you diplomats like to do? All Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain there's but one China, that Taiwan is part of China. We said that, signed that. That's in there. We signed it. Chinese signed it. And we affirmed that the United States was interested in a peaceful settlement. This is the key word, a peaceful settlement of the Taiwan question by the Chinese themselves. In other words, no external intervention. So the second communique was by Jimmy Carter with Deng Xiaoping. That was 1979. And this is one that established diplomatic relations between the United States and China. It ended our official recognition of Taiwan. We no longer had diplomatic relations with Taiwan. Taiwan ROC stands for Republic of China, which is the nationalist government, the Taiwan government. All military personnel were pulled back from Taiwan, and the defense treaty with Taiwan was abrogated. And this led to the United States establishing the American Institute of Taiwan, which is not an embassy, but it has all the functionality of an embassy. The employees who work there are foreign service employees, but they have to resign from the foreign service to work there. And I went there once to help with the commercial problem we were having in Taiwan. So that's our AIT is our representation in Taiwan. Yes, sir. Okay. The third communique was Ronald Reagan. So this is an all-star cast. I want to emphasize this. How we got here was not a partisan issue. Republicans and Democrats were all involved in developing this China policy over this 50-year period. This is a 50-year history we're going through very quickly. The last one with Reagan, again, the Chinese were concerned that we were selling arms to Taiwan. And we said arms sales to Taiwan would be reduced based on peaceful policy by the PRC, People's Republic of China, towards Taiwan. And PRC officials focused that we would respect China's sovereignty. And again, the one China policy that you keep hearing about. This is really important to the people in China. They have fantasies about Taiwan, what life is like in Taiwan. It's curious. There was a period where people I work with were allowed to go to Taiwan as tourists. And they all went there to see what it was like. And in Taiwan has preserved some of the old Chinese culture. For example, the writing system is the old writing system, where the writing system in mainland China is the simplified Chinese characters. And a lot of the old religious customs have been preserved in Taiwan. So there's a real curiosity by the mainland Chinese about Taiwan. It wasn't destroyed in the Cultural Revolution like so much of the culture in China was destroyed. So Reagan was involved in this one. And this led to basically a pretty peaceful period through the 80s until Tiananmen Square. And this is a shock to everybody in the West. There's a really important lesson about Tiananmen Square that we have to go through today and make sure we understand. The students there's a lot of frustration in China in the late 80s. People were hoping for faster change. There's a period of very rapid inflation, unavailability of commodities. And so people were frustrated, and they thought the students came with this democratic idea in Tiananmen Square and demonstrated, and ultimately was crushed by tanks, as we all know, when it went into Tiananmen Square and cleared out everybody. And a lot of people were killed and lost their lives. And the lesson is that the hegemony of the Communist Party is the number one priority of the Chinese government. If that is threatened, they will do anything to stay in power. That is the lesson of Tiananmen Square. Well, our relations went on ice under George W. Bush, or George H. Bush, just for a year or so, but they quickly reestablished. And this man on the right, Deng Xiaoping, who was an ardent communist, he studied in France as a student. He was on the Long March to Mao Zedong, the famous Long March, for those of you who know Chinese history. And he was a cadre, a very overzealous cadre in Sichuan province, responsible for the deaths of many people in the early years of consolidating the rule in mainland China. He became a reformer. He was persecuted in the Cultural Revolution. 3 times he was sent down to the demoted and punished, and 3 times he was rehabilitated. And he emerged after Mao's death in 1976 as a leader of China. He's revered today for his reforms, which are mostly economic reforms, and he articulated a foreign policy that's called, these symbols here, these characters are Tao Guang Yang Wei, which is an ancient idiom. The Chinese language is filled with military idioms. If you remember, the Chinese language is 2,000 years old, and they have idioms from the early periods that are very much part of their culture today. So, and when, even in business, people would quote idioms to me for various situations. And I learned to quote some of the idioms also for various situations, which was an effective way to communicate. Tao Guang Yang Wei means bide your time and conceal your strengths. In other words, the economy was in a shambles when Deng Xiaoping took over. Let's rebuild the economy. Let's rebuild the military, and let's get stronger. And let's not make the West worried about what we're doing. That was his policy. But it led to a very peaceful period in Asia. This almost a 40-year period from the 80s until the 30-year period until Xi Jinping came to power. There was a lot of excitement in China when I was working there about China joining the World Trade Organization. I was not living there at the time, but I was visiting. Everybody was excited about getting into the WTO, and China's economy took off once they joined the WTO in 2001 at 15% per annum GDP growth. This is astounding growth. I mean, the United States, in comparison, grows at 2 or 3% a year. This led to an interesting period in Asia where 500 million Chinese people were lifted out of poverty, and the income level went way up. So when we were there, it was a period of optimism. There was jobs. There were more jobs available. People's income was rising. Consumer goods started flowing into the markets. Just really during the time we were there, it was a golden period. And you can see here's a picture of Deng Xiaoping. I think maybe some of you remember that. This is when he went. I think he was in Houston, and he had his picture taken with a cowboy hat at a rodeo. And it was just a happy time between our countries. It's too bad it didn't last. So then everybody talked, whether Republicans or Democrats, our policy was to assure the peaceful rise of China. I don't think we can blame anybody for what's happened today, because if it was wrong, everybody was wrong. This all changed with the emergence of this man, Xi Jinping. I think XI is pronounced Xi. Xi Jinping was appointed the party leader of China in 2012. He just was last fall, got his 3rd term. It was confirmed in the last few weeks that he is, for their 5-year terms, he's in power now for an unprecedented 3rd term. Deng, after Mao, said we don't want anybody in power for more than 2 terms, 2 5-year terms. So Xi has broken that precedence, and it's a complicated period. We're entering into a very autocratic period in the Chinese leadership. And he announced in 2012 in his speech, and I think this is important, this is a translation of a speech, that the Chinese nation has ushered in a great leap. That's a reference to the Great Leap Forward. You remember that in the late 50s, when they were going to transform themselves from an agrarian to an industrial economy in 3 years? That's what that's a reference to, just standing up. Where did I introduce that phrase, standing up? Mao said the Chinese people have stood up. Exactly. So he's referencing that to getting rich. Who said it was okay to get rich? That was really anti-communist thing to say. Deng Xiaoping. He said it was okay to get rich. So in these words, Xi is summarizing the policy of the last couple decades to becoming strong, which is Xi Jinping's policy. China is going to become strong. So in this one sentence, summarize it all. He then goes on to say, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation has entered an irreversible historical process. He just used this exact sentence last weekend at this party conference. The exact sentence was used again. This is important. What does he mean by the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people? Well, I think he means this. If you like old maps, like Peter and I do, this is an old map of the Qing dynasty. Qing is pronounced Qing. You know them as the Manchurians. Remember The Last Emperor? The movie The Last Emperor? That was the last of the Qing emperors. This is a map of the Qing dynasty got control of, overthrew the Ming dynasty approximately 1643, 1644. They quickly consolidated power all over the mainland of China, first in the south. They came from the northeast, from Manchuria. That's where the Manchurians come from. They expanded south. And in the 1700s, they consolidated outer Mongolia, Xinjiang, and Tibet. But even furthermore, Korea was a tributary state to China. Every year, the Koreans sent representatives to pay tribute to the Emperor of China. All the countries of Southeast Asia were in a tributary relationship. Taiwan was annexed to the Qing Empire around 1680. So Taiwan's been part of China since 1680, and this is a Chinese argument why it's still part of China. And even out here, this little island called Okinawa. Okinawa was part of a tributary relationship with China, and this lasted until the Japanese became powerful in the 1800s and forced them to change their allegiance. Okinawa is now part of Japan. It was part of China at that time in this tributary relationship. So, and then if you go to the southern area, all the countries in Southeast Asia have large Chinese populations. Singapore is a Chinese city-state. Malaysia has a large Chinese population. Even Vietnam has a large Chinese population. And that's what he's talking about, that these are also part of the Chinese people. So when he looks out and says, this is my claim, the first island chain, which is where our 7th Fleet sails up and down both sides of this red line, that this is a sphere of influence. The only problem he has, if he looks out there today, this is what he sees. Yikes. It's all American bases. And this week he was complaining, and there was in the news the Chinese were complaining that the United States is trying to contain China. What do you think? Think we're trying to contain China? Yes, sir. The map did. I don't think the claim did. I think that was artist's rendition. It's a nice map that I pulled off the internet. Sorry. But these bases are here. You know, we have extensive military bases in the Philippines, Guam, Okinawa, and a lot of these islands all the way here. And they're all different Air Force and Navy bases. We Marines stationed here to assert our control of this area in the East China Sea. So for the Chinese first step in pushing back was actually started before Xi Jinping. It started under the previous leader, Hu Jintao. They pulled out some maps that were created by the Kuomintang at the end of World War II. Kuomintang are the Nationalist Party, and they had a map that they claimed the whole South China Sea. It was called the 9-dash line map, and this is referring here. These are 9-dash lines, and they started in 2010 and 11. They started printing passports that had this map in there with the 9-dash lines. So Chinese tourists would show up in Vietnam with this map in their passport, and the Vietnamese were infuriated by this because they were claiming all the land that Vietnam claimed. They're claiming the entire South China Sea, which is very rich in fisheries, very rich in oil and gas, and all Chinese maritime trade transits through the South China Sea. So this is really a pretty aggressive move, and it shocked everybody. And there was the Southeast Asian countries would not let tourists in that had this map in their passports. They had to come back without that map in the passport. Then they started building, militarizing coral reefs, converting them into pumping sand on them and making them into sort of fixed-based aircraft carriers, started building runways, putting missile installations and radar installations. They pledged to one of our secretaries of state that they would not militarize these islands. A year later, they did. And we don't recognize this. And this is one of the big flashpoints. We routinely have freedom of navigation operations where we send Navy ships by these islands. We fly airplanes over these islands, and they tell us to get away. This is our Chinese territory. You're not allowed here. And we say this is international waters. And we know about the drone that was shot down over the weekend in the Black Sea. The American drone are forced down by the Russians. The same thing could happen here at any time. China then started a very aggressive economic outreach. and this is Xi Jinping's signature policy. It's called the Belt and Road Initiative. And I was living in China when this came about. And in Chinese, the word is Yi-Dai Yi-Lu, one belt, one road. Strange kind of acronym or name, but we didn't really understand what this is about. They were aggressively building high-speed trains, lines, and we thought they were just building a land transportation route over what was the old Silk Road to project, improve trade and project power in Central Asia. Well, they then started a second initiative building ports along the old British trading routes. The most notable one was in Sri Lanka, where eventually they took over the port. The Sri Lankan government defaulted on some payments, and the Chinese cashed in and took over the port. They also built a base in Somalia, in Mombasa. The Somalian government leased the Chinese military a base right next to our U.S. base, which we're using to fight our war on terrorism from Mombasa. So our planes are actually landing in the same airspace right next to each other. They invested in a port in Greece, Piraeus. The Greek government was broke. They were glad to have the investment. They invested in ports in Northern Europe. So this became a trading initiative, but really it was projecting economic aid and buying influence. And one of the places where this has been most successful is in Africa. The Chinese have put in $143 billion of investment since 2018 into Africa. And they've bought a lot of influence. The Africans, first of all, are glad to have the investment. The United States has ignored Africa, and the Europeans are disliked because of colonialism, strongly disliked. They'd rather do business with the Russians or the Chinese than with Europeans or with us. And the Chinese are giving away a lot of money, and they're not asking a lot of questions. There's very little strings attached to the Chinese money. This resulted in a lot of business, and my company was involved in it. I was kind of thrilled at the time because we were the product was made in China. We could sell it into Africa they wanted our international brand, and we would these are electrical projects, big power stations, and we were selling the product into Africa, paid for by the Chinese government as part of this Belt and Road Initiative. They also did the same thing in Latin America. We ended up with a gigantic project in Brazil where part of it was made in New York near Buffalo, and the other part of it was made in Shanghai. And again, under this Belt and Road Initiative of basically buying influence through massive investment. In the United Nations today, if there's any big vote going on, the African nations will always side with the Chinese. China also started this 2025 initiative that they were going to expand their capability in technologies and be number one in the world. This sounds like Jack Welch. I don't know if anybody remember Jack Welch's thing that GE was going to be number one or two in every industry. Well, China was going to be number one under Xi Jinping in every one of these key technologies. I don't know if they've succeeded, but they certainly made a lot of progress, from artificial intelligence, new materials, pharmaceuticals, robotics, clean energy, aviation, and telecommunications. And certainly they're the leaders in facial recognition. They're masters of that. They have cameras all over tracking every move you make. They also really shocked Australia by investing in port facilities and financial aid to the Solomon Islands, which was contested during the Second World War by the Australia and the United States against the Japanese. This is really a pretty aggressive move. The relationships with Australia soured, especially under COVID. The Australians in 2020 requested that an investigation be made of China on the sources of COVID. The Chinese, who had been major customers of Australian produce, Australian wine, the stores are filled with Australian wine. They stopped buying everything made in Australia. And the relations are going to be very, very sour between Australia and the United States. And then this move in the Solomon Islands. And then there was the Hong Kong security law. Deng Xiaoping made a deal with Margaret Thatcher that when Hong Kong became part of China in 1997, it'd be one country, two systems. And then we all know that in 2020, the Chinese put down the democratic demonstrations against these new security laws. And Hong Kong has basically been absorbed into China. So it's a pretty disconcerting situation. Then you look at Taiwan. The Chinese are regularly making incursions into Taiwan airspace with their air forces simulating an attack on Taiwan. The Taiwan jets scramble and meet them. And we've been very careful as a country. Again, this concept of strategic ambiguity. We have told Taiwan that we don't guarantee your defense. We don't say we tell China we may defend them, we may not. We can't say that. And the reason is we're doing this is we don't want the Taiwan government to get too bold and declare independence from China. So that's why we have this policy in place of strategic ambiguity. Well, that's changed last summer with Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. We know that really was, the Chinese were deeply offended by that. Pelosi's not just the Speaker of the House, she's the third person in the line of succession in the US government. So it's a very powerful position. The Chinese were very disturbed by this. And the day after she left, they basically surrounded the island in these red zones were areas where they simulated a naval and air blockade of the island of Taiwan. Before that, they never crossed what's called this median line. They never crossed there before. Earlier military episodes were in this live fire exercises were in this area on the west side or the west side of the line. So this was quite a display of power. They're playing in all the video screens in China at the time. I submit that part of it was to distract the Chinese people from the zero COVID policy that was going on, that they were quite angry about. That this was a useful way to distract their attention. I called friends in Taiwan. They were unconcerned. They weren't, other than reading the news, they were no more aware of this than we were, and their feeling was that the U.S. had their back. So Biden then said, we do. 3 times last year, he said we would defend Taiwan. Now, this is a major change in United States policy. And each time his staff walked it back and said, no, that's not true. He didn't really mean that. So I don't know. What did he mean? You guys tell me. He's being Biden. Okay. And then the U.S. Senate, after Pelosi's visit, approved $6.5 billion more weapons for Taiwan. Remember, all our negotiations from the first Shanghai Protocol was to reduce our arming of Taiwan. Well, we're going the other way. We're really now making it into what people call a porcupine strategy to prevent a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. So how do we respond to all this? I mean, it's pretty provocative from our side. From the Chinese side, we're pretty provocative. Our response has been, to me, has been surprisingly fast. I'm really surprised at the rate at which things have changed. And the first big response, again, a bipartisan initiative. Who but the communist Chinese could unite the Republicans and Democrats in this country? But they did. And we passed this CHIPS and Science Act, $280 billion to build factories in the United States to import, to manufacture these chips. This phone has a lot of technology in it. The chips are called thin wafer chips. They're like 4 or 5 nanometers thick, these chips. The only company in the world that makes these is Taiwan. There's a company there called TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, and they are the most advanced chip maker in the world. And when this phone is made, the chips are made in Taiwan. It then goes to China, where it's assembled, and then comes to the United States, where it's sold. So the Chinese really don't have the technology to make this phone, and they don't have a lot of the chip technology for these advanced military weapons. Everybody's got to get them from Taiwan or some of the other places around the world, but they're not available. The Chinese are way behind in advanced semiconductor manufacturing. They're trying to catch up. Meanwhile, we're concerned, what happens if Taiwan is attacked by China? Where are we going to get our chips? So there's been a number of projects started. This CHIPS Act funded them. The next one was Intel is investing in a chip making factory in Ohio. I think TSMC is investing in one in Arizona, is it? Arizona. And another chip manufacturer is investing in one. One is in Syracuse. I think it's NVIDIA. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the problem. This is a temporary solution. Actually, will force them to invest rather than buy from us. That's the argument against doing this. So, and that goes on. My wife's brother works for Intel, and he's very mad that I'll get to Huawei in a second. That they were not allowed to sell their chips for Huawei Communications because all they're going to do is develop their own chips. But The manufacturing equipment for these chips it's called advanced photolithographic technology. That equipment is made in the Netherlands. We persuaded our Dutch allies to not sell this equipment to the Chinese. This is all in the last 6 months. Huawei, we've been attacking Huawei since the Trump administration, and the Biden administration has continued it and basically prevented us from selling technology to Huawei. Yes.
We turn to, we get Taiwan to invest in Arizona, in India, and the Dutch. So what's happening is a coalescing around two major structures, and I use democracies versus autocracies. But there are groups around that that are playing off both sides.
Well, I see on LinkedIn, my friends who work for some of the companies like Flex Technology, they're advertising how Flex is going to help the United States reshore everything, and in the process, they're going to make a lot of money in the process of doing it. And so there's going to be a lot of business opportunities here. Hopefully, some of the money will be effectively spent. We'll see. So Huawei was the other one that was under attack by the Trump administration. Interesting, in Africa, all the telecommunications are by Huawei. So the Chinese completely control the continent with the telecommunications. But we can't, our companies are banned from participating in supplying the technology for this communications. We've also had a substantial military response very quickly, almost really startling how quickly things are moving. And has anybody heard of this thing called the Quad? John has. This is an alliance of 4 countries, Australia, India, Japan, and the United States, to basically, I don't know if block China is the right word, but to stand up to China. And I don't know how reliable an ally India is, but they've had some big differences with China. There was a major border clash in the Himalayas between India and China about 2 years ago. Australia, I described how concerned they are about China. Yes, sir. Okay. My responsibility included all Asia Pacific. Had a big factory in China that we were making high voltage power capacitors, which are used in electric transmission. And we had some contracts with Australia, the Australian government, and we were quite successful. We tried to sell a very complex system in a joint venture with the Chinese state grid, and we got thrown out in the first round because they didn't want China having any projects on their transmission grid. So it's gotten quite serious. So this is an alliance between our 2 countries and between our 4 countries, but this expanded into something else that's been in the news this week called AUKUS. Has anybody heard of AUKUS? Australia, United Kingdom, Great Britain, and the United States. The French had a deal with Australia to sell them diesel-powered submarines. Well, these diesel-powered submarines are not very effective. First of all, they can't travel very far underwater. And second of all, they make a lot of noise. They're easy to detect. So the Australians, the United States, and the Brits made an alliance, an agreement together that we would supply them nuclear-powered submarines. This is a really big game changer. A nuclear-powered submarine can stay off the Chinese coast underwater for 73 days, and it's almost impossible to detect with current technology. And the idea was that we were going to build the submarines in Australia and base them in Australia in a place called Perth, and also up here in Darwin. Pardon me? Yeah, so France lost the deal. France was going to sell them the diesels. Thank you. France is going to sell them the diesel-powered submarines, and the Australians broke the contract. The French recalled their ambassador from Australia, Britain, and the United States. They were really quite angry. I think Macron has some other worries going on right now. That problem is passed. And meanwhile, this week, if you're following the news, Biden was in San Diego with the Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of UK to accelerate this deal, to sell them some submarines made here to get them there faster. So we're going to have a nuclear submarine base in Australia. Now, I had dinner this week with one of the guys from Australia that I used to work with. He's in town, and so I said, "What do you think of this?" And he said, "We'd rather." I said, "Now you've made Australia a nuclear target." There's another guy at the dinner table from New Zealand. New Zealand has prohibited American nuclear weapons to any ship with a nuclear weapon to stop in New Zealand. They're not allowed. But Australia is very concerned about the Chinese and the threats they had and all the trade embargoes they put them on in the last couple of years. So they're all in. The public is all in on wanting to be part of this deal. They're really afraid of what the Chinese are doing. At the end of the year, our Congress authorized an additional $10 billion of aid to Taiwan. Japan, as part of the end of World War II, had a pacifist constitution, and they've changed their constitution to allow them to build military equipment. They're concerned not only about the Chinese, but about the North Koreans, who periodically shoot nuclear-capable missiles over the islands of Japan. So there's a lot of concern here. And even the Philippines, they have a new president in the Philippines, the son of Ferdinand Marcos. He's called Bongbong, that's his nickname. He has invited the United States back in to the Philippines to set up bases in the Philippines. There's 4 bases where the United States is going to return, and one of them is 90 miles from Taiwan. So we're gearing up to block China, and that's what the Chinese are accusing us of. I think it's true. And the Solomon Islands, I learned something in doing my research here. I knew that we had made a counter moves to the Solomon Islands to block them from block the Chinese influence, but we even sent Wendy Sherman, Assistant Secretary of State. It's a pretty high level position, I think, isn't it? She's number 2 Secretary of State. She went to the Solomon Islands, and she took with her Carolyn Kennedy. And what I didn't know was Carolyn Kennedy is remember the daughter of John Kennedy. She is our ambassador to Australia. The two of them went to Solomon Islands because both their fathers were in the Battle of Guadalcanal, to remind the people of the American involvement in protecting them from the Japanese in the Second World War. So we're really stepping up our activities. We've announced an initiative in Southeast Asia with a $150 million investment. I guess that's pretty small in the scale of things, but nevertheless, it shows you a trend. And we come then to this concern we have, the book goes into, is this Chinese-Russian alliance. This is a part of the book I had a little trouble with because I know from living in China that the Chinese people look down on the Russians. And talking to John, he tells me the Russians people look down on the Chinese. So I don't know what kind of alliance this is going to be and how successful it's going to be. And pardon me? Yeah. So they had a meeting before the Beijing Olympics, and that Taiwan is, and during the meeting they asserted that Taiwan is part of China. They opposed the AUKUS agreement. They opposed NATO expansion. How about that? And they opposed U.S. missile defense. They're opposed to everything that we're for, and opposed to U.S. global hegemony and democracy, and they want to strengthen their cooperation. Well, it sounded pretty good a year ago. People got concerned about this. But when you look at the earlier defense spending numbers I showed you, Russia is really a minor power, other than they are a nuclear armed state. Well, things haven't gone so well for Putin in Ukraine, and this has threatened their no limits partnership. And so, how good a partner is Putin going to be for the Chinese, and how much are the Chinese willing to help Putin? Did I get this? Okay. So Beijing believes it has 3 advantages in their competition with the United States. The first is that they have the largest Navy in the world. They have more ships. This chart is right out of your Great Decisions book. They have a bigger Navy on paper than any of the other countries. But in terms, that's a qualitative advantage, or a quantitative advantage. But in terms of qualitative advantages, we have substantially more advanced ships, whether it's aircraft carriers, cruisers, or submarines, or airplanes. But the Chinese have been developing a lot of asymmetrical capabilities, like land-to-ship missiles, for example, to keep us away from their coast. So it's not a clear situation. I mean, we do not have the security we had For example, 30 years ago, there was a conflict in the Taiwan Straits, and we sent an Aegis aircraft fleet, Navy fleet, up to Formosa Straits with all our radars turned on to send a message to the Chinese not to intimidate Taiwan. I don't think we would do that today. They have a capability to take them all out with land to ship missiles. We've also invested in high-speed railroad into Laos, which takes them right to the border of Thailand. And these trains really move fast, and they can get people to one place to another fast, and goods and services to one place, from China to Southeast Asia. So they do have an advantage of being close. So we have two competing visions of the future. What does the future hold? Are we going to be containing China, which again, they complained this weekend in their conference in Beijing that we're trying to contain them. And it's hard to argue with what I showed you that that's not true. And Chinese vision is not the first island chain. They've envisioned a claim to the second island chain that includes Guam, all the way out to Guam. They want to push the United States back beyond the second island chain. That is their objective. I would argue that's a reversal of our 200-year westward expansion from our 13 colonies all the way across to California, all the way to Hawaii, all the way to the Philippines, all the way to the shores of China at the end of World War II. They want to push us back. That is their vision of the future. And they want to create their own spheres of influence further back. Yes, sir. I think it's both. Yeah, they don't want our fleet sailing off their coast. We don't really have time to go into the history, but there's a horrible naval history between China and the West. First, the British going up and down their coast, bombarding it in the 1800s, and the Japanese later on in 1895, the first Sino-Japanese War. They have a long memory of how they were tormented by the Brits and the Japanese navies over the course of their history. And that's part of what they teach their kids in school. And they believe to protect themselves, they've got to push the foreign powers away from their shore, from their sphere of influence. In the same way Monroe didn't want the British hanging around in the Caribbean. It's really very similar. So as I was putting this presentation together, and I've kind of been building this all spring, it was kind of grim. And then Blinken announced that he was going to go to China to see Xi Jinping, and maybe they were going to finally start talking. We hadn't had any real dialogue, any diplomatic dialogue. And I thought, man, Blinken's going to China, Xi Jinping is blinked. But what happened? We know about the spy balloon. This kind of put everything on ice. And we're not talking. There are some recent updates in the last 2 weeks. Kevin McCarthy didn't want to be outdone by Nancy Pelosi. He was planning his own trip to Taiwan. And the last minute, the Taiwan government said, why don't Tsai Ing-wen make an unofficial visit to the United States? We don't have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, so she cannot make an official visit, but she's been invited to speak at the Reagan Institute, and she's going to meet Kevin McCarthy in Southern California rather than in Taiwan. This is a major change, and we blinked, or Taiwan blinked. Yes, sir. Right, wanting to stimulate the economy. Good point. Yeah, so she wanted to cool things down. So Blinken was going to go there. The economy is in a shambles because of this zero COVID, which has been a contraction in economic activity. My secretary was confined to her home for 10 weeks. And she got so angry, she started sending me messages on WeChat, which was all censored by the government, complaining about XJP. XJP means Xi Jinping. I couldn't believe she was doing that. I told her to cool it. They want to get their economy moving, so they agreed to talk to Anthony Blinken. Of course, I think at this time we're so cautious about China, what kind of blank check we're all going to write for China. I don't think we're going to forget so quickly what's happened in the last couple of years. The other thing that's happened is China has a fateful choice to make about Ukraine. Russia's been trying to get China to supply them with weapons. We've told China, if you do this, they're going to, we're not going to forgive you. And so far, they really haven't done that. So Putin hasn't gotten much out of the Chinese officially. On the other hand, the Chinese are, every time the West sanctions Russia, they did during when I was in China too, the Chinese negotiated a super good deal on oil and gas price market levels to bring into China. They just did that during this, when we had the boycott on Ukrainian oil and gas. The Chinese picked the slack up, but they didn't buy it at world market prices. They negotiated a significant discount. And they all I can still think of my employees, they all laugh about it. They take pride in getting one over on the Russians. Again, there's no love by the average Chinese for the Russians. So this leads me near to the end of my presentation, my remarks today. And those of you who are interested, get your iPhone out and take a picture of this. These are 5 good books on China if you want. The one on the left is the Financial Times Book of the Year last year called The Chip Wars. Since we're in a library, I have to recommend books. The bottom left is Kevin Rudd. He's the President, Australian Ambassador to the United States. He was previously Prime Minister of Australia. His party's back in power. Now he's representing Australia in the United States. And he's a fluent Mandarin speaker. He studied extensively in China as a young person, and he knows Xi Jinping on a personal basis. So he wrote a book about how to avoid war between the West and China. Destined for War was an early one that came out about potential clash between the United States and China. They use the analogy of a rising power. What was it? The Peloponnesian Wars, the Thucydides trap, and then more recently that Germany was a rising power that challenged Britain, who was the incumbent power, and that led to a war. This is update. This book, Destined for War, was done by Graham Allison. It was connected with Johns Hopkins as well as Harvard. The bottom one, Danger Zone, is more recent. This is Johns Hopkins guys, and I read this book early fall, and many of the things that they were recommending, all the military actions and so on, were in the suggestions in the last couple of chapters of what they should do. And this last one on the right, I just finished, Overreach. This is written by Susan Shirk, a diplomat that now works at the University of California. Now, this is a podcast by her, so I think it's a really good way to end this presentation. She said, "Well, what should we do? What should the United States and China do?" And what was her recommendation? She said that China should not overreach. In other words, not keep grabbing islands and testing everywhere, and the United States should not overreact. So that was her advice for staying out of trouble. I thought that was pretty good advice. So these questions are at the back of your Great Decisions book, and I don't know if it's it's useful for a discussion. So, what should the United States policy be towards Taiwan and China? Can we work with China on global and foreign policy issues, for example, climate change and controlling North Korea? You notice North Korea hasn't even entered into this discussion. That's really a wild card. What's going on there? Is it possible to work with China to limit Russian aggression in Ukraine? Should the USA expand multilateral trade and defense alliances like we're doing with the Quad? And how serious a threat is the China-Russian alliance? Those are the questions at the back of the book. So with that, I'm going to get a drink of water and pause. Thank you. Well, what do you think? Sure.
What does China think about North Korea?
So the question is, what does China think about North Korea? Well, I always go down, I would say, I can answer that. My answer is I don't know, but I can tell you what the average Chinese person thinks about North Korea. And they refer to the North Korean leader as Jing Sanpong. Jing is the name for Kim in Chinese. Kim has a name as a character. The character in Chinese is Jing. I think it's gold. San is 3, Kim the 3rd. Pong is fat. They actually have emojis on their phone of him, a fat little Kim the 3rd. That's what they call him. They think he's a joke, and they think the average Chinese thinks the North Korean state is a joke. I think the Chinese government sees it right now. oftentimes they see him as an annoyance. They would like him to control. He's testing nuclear weapons right on the border with China. I've driven to the border of North Korea on the Chinese side, and they don't like that at all. And he doesn't really coordinate with them. He's doing his own thing. They don't like that at all. But right now, they're more concerned with what the United States is doing. So I think he's a useful pawn in aggravating the United States. But it's kind of a dangerous game they're playing because who knows what he's going to do. What do you think, John?
China sees North Korea as a useful pawn played off against Japan and the United States.
Yeah, that's what I think too.
We were talking about where do we go from here, and I still think this is all over the structures that we put in place after World War II, which were very U.S. centric in terms of economics, in terms of politics, in terms of law. China wants, and to a degree Russia as well, and probably to a degree India and Turkey and Iran, all were not participants in deciding what those things were. I think they're not collectively, but sequentially interested in rectifying this and coming up with a structure. Unless we come up with a structure, I think we're going to be moving in the direction of two different spheres: economic spheres, political spheres. And I think what that's going to do is cost a great deal of money. I mean, what we went through with this globalization at the tail end of the industrial age was just incredibly good for a lot of people, but especially good for us.
Yeah. And one of the things I didn't really bring out very well was that this is the end of. I see this kind of as a tail end of colonialism. That these countries are trying to reestablish their own nation states, and we haven't completely resolved the situation. For example, the Vietnam War was about the divisions of the French Empire in Vietnam, and now modern Vietnam is a really progressive place today. Those of you who've been there, it's really hopping place. They don't like the Chinese at all. They want nothing to do with them. We were so afraid that they were going to be a domino against China. And unfortunately, the Korean War never allowed them to resolve the divisions of Korea, of the Korean Peninsula after the war. The Chinese are angry about how they were dismembered by colonialism, and they want to restore their greatness. They want to make China great again and restore back to the days of the emperors, the imperial dynasties, of course, run by the Communist Party.
As we watch the way you showed up there, the amount of money that China has expended in Latin America and Africa, that has not come without cost.
Absolutely.
Their behavior and how they go about doing these things have turned off. I know in Zambia, a country I served in, they're pulling out of their relationship with China. So China's behavior is not necessarily well received.
Joan befriended, I never hung out with the diplomats until I retired and met these guys. But Joan befriended the consul general of Shanghai's wife. And the only time that, at least that I was ever in the U.S. consulate in China was in Shanghai, we got invited. They were to a going away party. And at this going away party, there's a couple Chinese people there. I was wondering when we went in, I was kind of uncomfortable going in because I'm sure they were monitoring who was attending that evening. There was a Chinese man sitting in a corner, vociferously criticizing his government over all their antagonisms in the South China Sea. I just couldn't believe what he was doing or what he was saying. And the ambassador or the consul general was kind of staying clear of the guy. But I often wonder what happened to him after that dinner party. I don't think so. Yes. I think it's another great. So the question is, how do we see the fact that Chinese is the biggest investor of U.S. Treasury bills, right? And so we owe China a lot of money, and I would say that I think that's another example, a great example of the interdependence of our two countries. That there's really good reasons for us not to have a conflict, because China would lose all that debt, and we would lose all that credit. So there's a lot of reasons for us to stay together, and that's one of them, I think. Yes. 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 Mhm. Have you been to China? Have you been to China? Oh, okay. You need to go take a look. Yes, yeah, they're ghost cities there. We've driven through them. You drive through these modern cities and no one's living in them. Even the area where near where I worked was they call it Xingcheng, which means new city. Everybody wanted to live in Laocheng, which means the old city, because that's it's all the nightlife and culture was in the old city, and they built these sterile new cities. But people were buying up these apartments there as like a second apartment as an investment. They didn't have to live in it, and they were very highly leveraged, but they had it as a second investment. That at least that's what they thought. And the China real estate prices are kind of built on on a house of cards. It's not clear; it could easily collapse. But
Do you see potential punitive damages for China if COVID actually escaped one of their labs?
so the question is, do we see punitive damage against China if COVID escaped from one of their labs? You can. I would suggest that you go there and collect. Okay. you want?
Wow, that is showstopper.
You want the mic?
No, that's fine. I'll just, thank you all for coming.